Did you want to start over?
They're like, we're all set.
Okay.
Now we're not.
Okay. Yeah, because he didn't get down to one.
Yeah. They told me not to say one, so I'll mouth it, and then I'll put to you.
Okay.
Wonderful. All right, here we go. We are ready now. 5, 4, 3, 2, and...
Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman, and today our guest is Al Sykes, and we're talking about international trade. Al, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show so much now to talk with us, you know so much about so many different things, but the thing that really drove us to invite you this time was that President Trump has threatened to impose a series of tariffs as part of really his campaign promise to bring back industrial jobs, I guess, in the upper Midwest. And so he recently announced a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. And then he started to kind of back off a little bit. So it's not everywhere, not all the time. And I just wondered if you could take us through what's going on there.
The president initially announced across-the-board tariffs on steel and aluminum, and then quickly started to create exceptions, initially for Canada and Mexico. He's added a number of additional countries, Australia, Brazil, Europe, others. Although he's also said that these are not permanent exceptions. They're going to potentially expire unless there's some sort of negotiated arrangement that leads him to be willing to leave the tariffs off permanently. So that's what's going on, and this was all done in the name of protecting national security under a statute from 1962 that gives the president authority to take national security trade measures. So we are now in the process of seeing these tariffs applied to some countries like China, Japan, and others. Other countries are in the process of negotiating with us to keep their exemptions. And then the big, more recent announcement has to do with $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods because of Chinese practices in relation to our intellectual property. And that's coming down the pike. We don't quite know exactly what tariffs will be put on what, but that's said to be coming sometime around in June.
So I was just going to ask one thing, if I could, just to clarify, which is earlier when we were talking, you talked about the tariffs are all laws, and these tariffs haven't been passed by Congress or anything. This is the president using his national security powers?
Well, these are tariffs pursuant to statutes that delegate to the president the power to impose these tariffs. So the power rests with Congress, but historically Congress has often delegated to the president through federal statute the power to set tariffs, to modify them in accordance with trade agreements, to change them for national security purposes, to respond to unfair trade practices abroad, and so forth.
I have a different legal question for you, which is not whether the president can do it vis-a-vis our rules. But I thought we entered into rules with all these other countries, and we have agreements. How does the president's action relate to all those agreements? I assume we must have had an agreement on steel and aluminum before he acted.
Yes, those tariffs were subject to ceilings negotiated in the GATT, now the WTO, and also in various free trade agreements that we have. And so in the first instance, these higher tariffs will violate those ceilings, but these agreements also contain exceptions, and the national security exception is found in all of them. So the administration's position is that these are done for national security reasons, and by the way, the national security exception to, for example, the GATT is self-judging, so it's not reviewable by GATT adjudicators. Once we invoke it, there's no possibility of a challenge. Our counterparties in the WTO disagree with that, and there's a very good chance we'll see a legal fight over the national security exception.
Yeah. So is this the beginning of a trade war? I mean, if we do this to other countries, do they start doing this to our products?
Well, I think if we maintain these sorts of measures over time, it could very well become some magnitude of trade war. How big, I'm not sure. The steel and aluminum tariffs by themselves are not that big a deal. The other tariffs on China are more substantial. On the other hand, that's limited to just one country. So there could be a trade war on some scale if we don't negotiate a settlement of sorts that gets rid of these things in some reasonable period of time going forward.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Al Sykes about international trade. Joe?
I want to come back to the trade war, Al. Take us to what a trade war is like. I'm thinking we haven't had one recently. Do we have to go all the way back to the 30s to find a big example of a trade war? And suppose we get there, what would that do to the economy? What would it do to the cost of goods?
Well, so the last big trade war was in the 1930s, where we enacted the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and other countries enacted substantially higher tariffs in response. And that, no doubt, had some contractionary effect on the world economy. There's no doubt about it. How big it was is a subject of debate among economic historians. We've had smaller trade wars in more modern times where we had disputes over particular issues. Back in the 80s in the Reagan administration, we would complain about a trade practice by the Europeans, for example. They'd refuse to change it, and then we would unilaterally slap some sort of retaliatory tariff on them that was usually more or less proportional to the scale of whatever it was that we were complaining about. And it's costly, but these things haven't been by and large a huge disaster. It just depends on their scale.
What would it look like to be in a trade war? I mean, I try to imagine how on a kind of daily basis would people know we were at war?
Well, what people would see is that so China has already announced that it will target something like $3 billion of U.S. exports with retaliatory tariffs in relation to the steel and aluminum measures. And they've announced some potential exports that they would go after. And the industries that are trying to sell to China in those particular product lines will see some loss of business as a consequence. So they'll know it. Will there be riots in the streets? I doubt it. It's not a giant thing, but it'll be noticeable to the businesses that are the targets of retaliation.
I imagine if you're Boeing and are trying to sell planes to the China, or maybe you're a farmer trying to sell some grain to the China, those are people that would feel the effects.
Sure. Boeing is definitely a possibility. They could end up losing business to Airbus. U.S. agricultural exports could be diverted to other agricultural suppliers around the world. No question.
And T-shirts will cost me more.
Well, so far we don't have tariffs on Chinese T-shirts. So I'm not sure T-shirts will cost you more. But anything that we put a tariff on will cost you more.
Joe?
How about these other trade deals that the president opposes? NAFTA. Can you tell us what NAFTA is and what the arguments against NAFTA are?
Well, NAFTA is a preferential trade agreement that is permissible under the law of the WTO, that if you have what qualifies as a free trade agreement, you can give tariff preferences and certain other kinds of preferences to favored trading partners. In this particular case, it's Canada and Mexico. So they get better tariffs on their exports to the United States than other countries around the world that are not members of NAFTA.
And we get better tariffs when we
on
send
our exports
stuff
to
to
them. Yes,
Okay.
it's a reciprocal. Yeah. Ideally, it would be a completely free trade with no tariffs, but that's not the case in practice. Actually, considerable numbers of tariffs remain. So it's a preferential arrangement. Economists are less comfortable with those than they are multilateral deals, because the possibility exists that trade will be inefficiently diverted from, say, Australia to Canada simply because of Canada's tariff preference, even if the Australians were better at making and producing something. But these agreements are proliferating. There are now hundreds of them in the world economy. And as far as the question of what the problem is with NAFTA, it's a political problem. It is perceived to have caused some injury to particular industries that are politically sensitive. My own view is that the damage done by NAFTA is actually fairly small because the tariff preferences created by NAFTA are themselves fairly small for the most part because the multilateral tariffs under the WTO are so low already that a tariff preference often doesn't make that much of a difference. But politically, NAFTA has been a whipping boy for a number of years, more so, interestingly, than the WTO, which I suspect has a much greater economic impact as a practical matter.
A final question, Al. Could this all be for the good? I mean, we've got a president who's into the art of the deal. Could he use this threat to get China to change its IP laws, reduce its barriers to entry, drop all of this, and we end up looking good?
Yeah, that's entirely possible. The economic objection to protectionism is based on the idea that the protectionism will persist, but if the result is just a temporary period of protection that results in market opening abroad that benefits U.S. exporters, or as you say, better intellectual property protection abroad for U.S. intellectual property, then the United States could, in principle, come out ahead if this were just a negotiating gambit rather than a real move towards serious protectionism. I think there's sort of three hypotheses about what's going on. One is that there's a real move toward protectionism. One is that it's just a negotiating gambit that will ultimately improve things by opening up markets in our trading partners. And the third hypothesis is that it's more reality TV, that it's all a big political show that will get a lot of attention. We'll have negotiations. We'll have agreements like the new Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement that don't really change things very much, but the president can declare victory and run on it in the next election cycle.
Well, Al, you've just given us the best explanation using the best words.
I know what I'm voting for.
I just want to thank you so much for coming and joining us. And thank you for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Terrific.
That was great.
My pleasure.
Good?
Yeah, really good.
Okay.
Thank you.